The woman known to history as Catherine of Aragon was born on the 16th of December 1485 in the palace of Alcalá de Henares on the outskirts of Madrid. Her given name when born was Catalina, although she is widely known today by the version of her name which she adopted in England, the country where she would spend her entire adult life. Her father was King Ferdinand II of Aragon, one of the two constituent kingdoms of Spain at that time. Ferdinand's domains were in the north and east of the Iberian Peninsula, centered on cities such as Barcelona, Zaragoza, and Valencia, while the Aragonese had also carved out a small Mediterranean empire in the late Middle Ages, including the Balearic Islands, Sardinia, Sicily, and much of southern Italy, including the city of Naples. Catherine's mother was Queen Isabella I of Castile, the ruler of the other part of Spain. Castile encompassed the greater part of mainland Spain and extended from the northern coastline, south through Madrid and Toledo towards the south of the country, though by the time of Catherine's birth in 1485, a small enclave around Granada in the extreme south of the country remained in Muslim hands, and it was not until 1492 that her parents completed the reconquest of Spain and expelled the last Muslim powers back into North Africa. Catherine's parents had an unusual arrangement whereby Isabella effectively ruled Castile and Ferdinand governed Aragon. The terms of their marriage stipulated that their jurisdictions remained separate during their lifetimes. It would not be until the early 16th century that Spain would be ruled as one nation by a single monarch. Catherine's descent and early family life were peculiar and related to subsequent events in her life. On her mother Isabella's side, she was descended from the House of Lancaster of the English royal family. In Catherine's case, from John of Gaunt, the third son of King Edward III, who had ruled England between 1327 and 1377. In 1371, John had married Constance of Castile, linking the English royal family with the royal family of the Kingdom of Castile. As a result, Catherine was distantly related to the English royal line, and as befitted a young princess who was a member of two European royal dynasties, she received her education from a number of esteemed scholars, including two Dominicans, Pascual de Ampudia and Andres de Morales, and the Italian humanist brothers Alessandro and Antonio Geraldini. Emphasis was placed by them on Latin texts, but Catherine was also educated in European languages, as befitted the daughter of a king and queen who were known throughout Europe as the most Catholic of monarchs. There was a heavy emphasis on placing any learning she received in a Catholic Christian context, and the Bible and other liturgical texts were studied from early on. She evidently excelled in all of these, and many years later, Catherine was praised for her learning by none other than Erasmus of Rotterdam, the foremost scholar of the early Northern Renaissance. Catherine might have been born in Spain, but the infinitely more significant events in shaping her later life would be played out far to the north in England in the years prior to and following her birth. Since the mid-15th century, that country had been plagued by civil wars, brought about by the psychological collapse of King Henry VIII in the early 1450s. 30 years of unrest followed as Richard, 3rd Duke of York, and then his son Edward tried to assert their claim to the throne. Edward finally succeeded in this and became King Edward IV, but when he died in 1483, his brother Richard usurped the throne and became Richard III. Then, a new pretender arose by the name of Henry Tudor, a descendant of a Welsh family with a very tenuous claim to the throne of England. In 1485, Henry landed in England with an army and won a famous battle against Richard at Bosworth Field in the English Midlands on the 22nd of August 1485. Richard was killed that day, and Henry was proclaimed king as Henry VII. But Henry never lost sight of the fact that his family's claim to the throne was weak, and a new pretender could arise at any time. Indeed, several did, but unsuccessfully. Thus, he would need to form alliances with some of Europe's leading royal families, and he would also need to impart to his children the absolute necessity of securing the Tudor line and protecting the family's claim to the English throne. A sign of the English king's obsession with doing so was evident already in the late 1480s. In September 1486, when Catherine in Spain was still shy of her first birthday, Henry VII and his wife Elizabeth had their first child, a boy called Arthur. By the end of the 1480s, despite Catherine and Arthur still being toddlers in their respective royal households in England and Spain, Henry was already intent on entering into negotiations with Isabella and Ferdinand to bring about a marital agreement between young Arthur and Catherine. By the spring of 1488, Rodrigo González de Puebla, a doctor of law and Spanish diplomat, was in England to negotiate the terms of such a union. Both sides were anxious at this time that an alliance would be cemented, as Spain's rivalry with neighboring France was growing in a way which would soon see both nations vying for dominance of the Italian peninsula, and an agreement seemed to have been near completion in 1489. But negotiations broke down over a disagreement regarding the size of Catherine's dowry and how her household will be maintained in England through English crown funding. Nevertheless, these negotiations did result in the signing of the Treaty of Medina del Campo between England and Spain in 1489, whereby the two nations allied with each other, and while the marriage was not fully agreed to at this point, it remained viable. In the meantime, Catherine was growing up. She continued her education, which broadened as she got older to include arithmetic, law, history, philosophy, and some basics of heraldry and genealogy, the latter being an obsession of Europe's royal dynasties and noble families as they tried to ensure the continuity of their lines, an issue which would become paramount in Catherine's life in later years, and she travelled widely as all of this was being imparted to her. Her parents, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, were anxious to make their presence felt across Spain, as they united the two kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, and they spent time in each of the provinces as the royal court maintained a wandering existence in the 1480s and 1490s. As a result, Catherine was present at the fall of Granada in 1492 when the Muslim emirate there finally fell and Spain was brought fully under Catholic rule. Curiously, although she was still just a child at the time, Catherine seems to have remembered the episode, and she later chose the pomegranate, known as the Granada apple in Spain, as her personal emblem. Somewhat ironically, the pomegranate was a fertility symbol in early modern times. She cannot have been aware at the time she first used it as a symbol how much her life and all of England would be impacted by the vexed issue of her childbearing. In the mid-1490s, negotiations resumed yet again between Henry VII's government in England and Catherine's parents' government in Spain, concerning the proposed union between her and Prince Arthur. Henry's hold on the English throne had been questioned in the intervening period by a pretender by the name of Perkin Warbeck, who claimed to be King Edward IV's son Richard, who had almost certainly perished in the Tower of London at the hands of his uncle in the mid-1480s. Warbeck was at large in various places on the continent, and then in Ireland between 1491 and 1497, before he was finally apprehended and imprisoned. The whole episode had revealed two things. Firstly, it indicated how tenuous the hold of the Tudors on the English crown was, and secondly, it showed Henry that the Spanish monarchs was certainly the right choice for a marriage alliance. While a host of the European powers had been very willing to support Warbeck's cause in order to undermine England, Isabella and Ferdinand had been incredulous at the idea that Warbeck was the deceased prince, and had worked with the English king to expose the fact that Warbeck was actually an upstart from the Low Countries. And so, as Warbeck was heading towards his arrest, renewed intensity was lent to the negotiations over Catherine and Arthur's proposed marriage. Eventually, a new agreement was reached between the respective governments of England and Spain on the 1st of October 1497. The marriage would go ahead, but since neither Catherine nor Arthur were yet even teenagers, it would not take place until Arthur reached the age of 14, at which time Catherine would be 15. A papal dispensation would still be required even at that stage for the wedding to take place because they were so young, and that would be sought from Pope Alexander VI. A dowry of 200,000 escudos would be paid by the Spanish to Henry VII. In return, Catherine would receive revenues from the lands which Henry had assigned to Prince Arthur for his use. These would be used to pay for Catherine's household and affairs in England until such time as she became queen. With this revised treaty in place, assent was finally given to the proposed marriage, which had first been mooted nearly a decade earlier. It was ratified in January 1498, although some doubts remained about whether it would go ahead. These were finally allayed in May 1499, when a proxy wedding was held in England while Catherine was still in Spain. Further bickering over some of the financial specifics continued in the months that followed, but at last, in the autumn of 1501, Catherine set off from Spain to England. She would never return to her homeland. Catherine landed at Plymouth in the southwest of England on the 2nd of October 1501. There then followed a 5-week-long procession through southern England, during which she was joined by King Henry and her soon-to-be husband Prince Arthur, before they arrived to London on the 12th of November. Here, elaborate pageants and banquets were held before Arthur and she were married at St. Paul's Cathedral on the 14th of November. Exactly what followed would become a matter of extensive debate 30 years later, but Catherine was to later claim that although she and Arthur shared a bed on several occasions over the next few months, they never consummated their marriage. The other facts of what followed are uncontested. Within weeks of their marriage, Arthur, who was Prince of Wales, set out for Ludlow Castle to provide ceremonial governance of the principality, and Catherine went with him. But in Wales, they both quickly contracted the sweating sickness, a mysterious illness which was most likely caused by a rodent-borne hantavirus. Catherine survived, but Arthur did not, and when he died on the 2nd of April 1502, Catherine was left as a 16-year-old widow in a foreign land. The long-planned marriage, which had been the subject of negotiations throughout the entirety of Catherine and Arthur's young lives, had lasted less than 4 months. News was quickly sent concerning Arthur's demise to London, and from there dispatches were sent by King Henry's government to Spain to inform Catherine's parents that their daughter was already a widow, and these same dispatches were quickly responded to. Would it be possible, Isabella and Ferdinand wondered, for Catherine to now marry Henry's second son, also named Henry after his father? The boy was only just about to turn 12 years of age. But if they waited a few years, he and Catherine could wed, and the Anglo-Spanish alliance could be continued. When this proposal came to England, it was received positively. Both sides were anxious for the alliance to be secured, and as such, they quickly worked out the new agreement. By September, a draft treaty was prepared, with many of the financial arrangements continued from Catherine's marriage to Arthur to her new proposed one with Henry. The formal treaty was finalized in the summer of 1503, and it was agreed that it would be solemnized following receipt of a fresh papal dispensation, and once Henry reached 15 years of age. What is interesting is that neither side seems to have been overly concerned at this time about whether Catherine and Arthur had consummated their marriage, and it was simply assumed that they had. No major objections were raised to Henry marrying his sister-in-law from a marriage which had potentially been consummated. While all of this was proceeding in England, the international situation was in a renewed state of flux. Catherine's mother, Queen Isabella, died on the 26th of November 1504. Because the terms of her marriage arrangement with Ferdinand many years earlier had specifically stated that he could not rule Castile, and Isabella could not rule Aragon in their own rights, Isabella was now succeeded by her older daughter, Catherine's sister, Juana. Juana had married Archduke Philip of the Austrian Habsburgs some years earlier. Philip's family ruled Austria and the Burgundian inheritance of the Low Countries and parts of northeastern France, while they also had held the position of Holy Roman Emperor for several generations. Consequently, the union of the Spanish royal dynasty of the Trastamara's and the Austrian Habsburgs was now set to create a dynastic union which would unite large sections of Western and Central Europe under one house. This would eventually occur in the shape of Juana and Philip's son Charles, who would play a major role in his Aunt Catherine's life later on. But for now, the situation in Spain was that Juana became queen there. However, her own father, Ferdinand, was soon trying to establish himself as the all-but ruler of Castile, arguing that his own daughter was mad. All this was playing out as Catherine's marriage to Henry was being negotiated. The diplomatic unrest in Spain had a direct impact on Catherine and the marriage negotiations in England. King Henry VII was now having second thoughts. He and his councillors speculated that perhaps it would be best to support Juana and her husband Philip against King Ferdinand in what was turning into a polarizing issue in Spain, bordering on civil war within Castile. Accordingly, for a time in 1505 and early 1506, it seemed as though the marriage agreement would be renounced, a development which seemed all but assured when King Henry sent over £100,000 to Archduke Philip in the Low Countries to aid him in his and his wife's clash with Ferdinand. The English monarch at this stage was unwilling to tie his son and heir into a marriage with Catherine, which would become politically useless if Ferdinand was defeated by Juana and Philip. As had so often been the case, though, in Catherine's affairs, fate intervened. Philip died suddenly in Spain in September 1506, and the way was now cleared for Ferdinand to establish control over Castile, and so he effectively had his daughter confined to house arrest on the grounds that she was insane. Thus, with Ferdinand secure in his control of Castile, Henry yet again began to consider marrying his son to Catherine, but the uncertainty would drag on for several more years. We might ask, where exactly was Catherine during this long period of uncertainty in England, and what was she doing? As the widow of the Prince of Wales, the Spanish princess had been granted Durham House, the residence of the Bishop of Durham in London, as her own residence. Here she maintained an almost entirely Spanish entourage and was visited frequently by the Spanish ambassadors to England. She was learning English, although was still far from fluent by 1505, by which time she had been in the country for nearly 4 years. It is a sign of her reliance on her Spanish companions that she was still not fully versed in the native tongue after so long in England. Unfortunately, she had also been ill regularly, probably with tertian ague, a kind of mild form of malaria, but the greater problem for her was her financial position, as the penny-pinching Henry VII had consistently failed to abide by the terms of her marriage arrangement with Arthur and provide adequate support for her household. Her allowance was even revoked altogether for a time in 1505, as Henry lost interest in the new marriage negotiations. Additionally, concerted efforts were made to ensure that there was little contact between her and Prince Henry, her proposed marriage partner. As such, it was a difficult time for Catherine in the mid-1500s. A distinct change in Catherine's fortunes occurred in February 1508. That spring, a new Spanish ambassador, Gutierrez Gómez de Fuensalida, arrived in England specifically charged with finalizing the long-running marriage negotiations. Though these dragged on for more months, the impasse was broken on the 21st of April 1509, when King Henry VII died. The new king, Henry VIII, Catherine's long-proposed husband, summoned Fuensalida just over 2 weeks later and declared that one of his father's dying wishes had been for the marriage to proceed. It is unclear if the old king had actually said this or not, but the result was the same in any event. On the 11th of June 1509, 7 years after the marriage of Catherine and Henry had first been mooted, the couple were married at the Franciscan church at Greenwich Palace. She was 23, he was just a few days shy of his 18th birthday, and less than 2 weeks later, on Midsummer's Day, the 24th of June 1509, Catherine was crowned as Queen of England at Westminster Abbey next to her husband, who was anointed the same day as King Henry VIII. After nearly 8 years in England, Catherine's persistence had paid off. It was a clear sign of the tenacity she would show many years later when Henry became determined to end their marriage. Catherine held a considerable amount of influence over her husband and consequently over England's political affairs in the first years of Henry's reign. The political climate of these years for England was similar to what it had been for well over 200 years. Henry's enemies were France and Scotland, and the king viewed himself as a monarch along the lines of his medieval predecessors dating back to the days of King Edward I. In essence, then, his duty was to make war on France and make it clear to the Scots that England was the predominant power in Britain. Thus, after briefly flirting with a possible amiable approach to the French, he quickly discarded that possibility, and he would spend much of his long 38-year reign spending vast sums of money to try to restart the 100 Years' War with France, which had its heyday during the reign of Edward III in the 14th century. He also had responsibilities elsewhere, notably across the Irish Sea, where the English lordship had declined to a point where only Dublin on the east coast and a few of the surrounding counties such as Meath and Kildare were effectively under English rule. Overall, there was a more than fluid situation facing England on the international stage when Henry and Catherine became king and queen in 1509. Catherine's influence over her husband was manifested quickly. Within weeks of their marriage, she ensured that the Spanish ambassador was recalled home, and for a time thereafter, she actually acted as her father Ferdinand's official line of communication in England. And while a new ambassador, Don Luis Carros de Villaragut, eventually arrived in 1510, Catherine continued to play a prominent role in representing Spanish interests in her adoptive homeland. This was significant, as in 1511, Henry effectively turned his back on any offer of friendship from the French and allied with Ferdinand, as well as the papacy and the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, against France as part of the War of the League of Cambrai, a conflict which primarily played out in Italy. Having done so, Henry then assembled a large military force which was sent to the Basque Country in northeastern Spain with the goal of Henry and Ferdinand launching a joint military campaign to conquer Guyenne in southwestern France for England. Henry would no doubt have been disappointed by the outcome. His own troops mutinied, while Ferdinand used the rump of the forces to conquer the small Pyrenean Principality of Navarra for Spain. Despite this setback, clear signs of Catherine's prominent role in English affairs were seen the following year. In June 1513, Henry launched his own campaign to France, which he led in person, across the English Channel to land in the north of the country. In the weeks that followed, he campaigned in northeastern France in association with the Austrian Habsburgs. In his absence, Catherine served as governor of the realm and captain general of England during the late summer and autumn of 1513. It was a critical period. On the 22nd of August, King James IV of Scotland, who was acting in defence of Scotland's traditional ally, the French, invaded northern England. A large English army was quickly gathered, much of the logistical work being carried out by Catherine and the government's senior ministers. As a result, when the Earl of Surrey, Thomas Howard, commanded an English army against the Scots at Flodden on the 9th of September, they won one of the greatest victories over the Scottish ever achieved by English arms. Catherine had been gathering together a reserve force to aid Surrey and was heading north with it when news of the victory at Flodden was received. She also learned that King James and several of his senior nobles had died on the field. Writing to Henry, she stated, "In this your grace shall see how I keep my promise, sending you, for your banners, a king's coat." Yet, as much as Catherine's prominent role in the politics of the early 1510s indicates the influence she held at this time, there were already signs of future trouble brewing. The Queen, quite infamously, had a difficult gynecological history. She was reported to be pregnant on numerous occasions during the first 10 years or so of her and Henry's marriage. Some of these instances are based on ambassadorial reports, which featured mere rumours in the royal court, but there are more concrete details of some of Catherine's natal history. She became pregnant with a daughter very soon after her and Henry's wedding, but she miscarried in January 1510, and this was followed within a few months by a fresh pregnancy. This time she gave birth to a baby boy on the 1st of January 1511, who was named Henry after his father and grandfather and anointed as Prince of Wales. But he died 7 weeks later on the 22nd of February. It's possible that there was another boy born in September 1513, just days after the Battle of Flodden. But if this is so, he died within hours or days at the most. Another son was certainly stillborn in the early winter of 1514. It was not until a girl, Mary, was born in February 1516 that a child survived. But England had never had an undisputed queen, and as the years went by, Henry would pine evermore for a son to secure the succession and Tudor rule. The full implications of Catherine's natal woes would not become clear until the 1520s. In the meantime, the international situation was entering a more fluid state. England had made peace with France in 1514, as part of which it had been agreed that Henry's 18-year-old sister, Mary, would marry King Louis XII of France. Louis was 34 years older than Mary, but happily for the bride, he died just a few months later and was succeeded by his cousin Francis, a member of a cadet branch of the Valois royal family. And the following year, Catherine may have been influential yet again in getting Henry to agree to a renewal of the alliance with Spain. But when old King Ferdinand died himself in 1516, he was succeeded by his grandson Charles. As successor to his mother's Spanish kingdom and his father Philip's Habsburg inheritance, Charles V would become the most powerful monarch in Europe, simultaneously ruling Spain, Austria, the Low Countries, and much of Italy, as well as serving as Holy Roman Emperor from 1519 onwards. The diplomatic map of Europe was now profoundly altered, and when Henry decided he wanted to end his marriage to Catherine several years later, he would be impeded by her nephew, the most powerful ruler Europe had seen for several centuries. This diplomatic realignment led to a curious experiment in diplomacy being undertaken towards the end of the 1510s by one of Henry's senior ministers and an individual who would play a large role in Catherine's affairs in later years. Thomas Wolsey had risen as the king's almoner in 1509 to become the Archbishop of York, and then to be made a cardinal of the church in 1515. By that time, he was also Henry's leading minister and handled an immense amount of government business. And in 1518, he determined to try to get the major Western and Central European powers to agree to renounce making war on each other for some time, in order to present a united front against the expanding Islamic Ottoman Empire in the Eastern Mediterranean. Though England, France, the papacy and Spain all agreed to the Treaty of London, it was soon discarded as Henry yet again looked to make war on France in the early 1520s. Nevertheless, it is an interesting episode in Wolsey's rise to the position of European statesman. He would soon be acting inadvertently as one of Catherine's supporters in her fight to resist Henry's desire for an annulment of their marriage. The causes of the king's later wish to end his marriage to Catherine were dynastic. As Catherine suffered stillbirth after miscarriage in the early 1510s, Henry had taken a mistress as early as 1514, and there were several more in the years that followed, and in 1519, one of these, Elizabeth Blount, gave birth to a boy. The king acknowledged him, and he was named Henry after him, with the addition of the title Fitzroy, meaning the son of the king. However, while this new child was acknowledged by Henry, he was still illegitimate in law and could not succeed to the throne. And what was increasingly at issue was Catherine's age. She had been over 5 years older than Henry when they married in 1509. In 1520, she was 35. This was certainly not so old that Catherine couldn't possibly become pregnant again, or even still have multiple children, but her complicated and arduous natal history, with its many miscarriages and stillbirths, did not inspire confidence in anyone at the English royal court that Catherine was likely to give birth to the legitimate male heir that Henry so desired. And as the months and years ticked past in the early 1520s, this concern turned more and more to a certainty. As it did, Henry would seek to end the marriage. We should pause here to ask who exactly was the woman who had become so central to English political affairs in the 1520s. Because of later events, Catherine has sometimes been depicted as merely a shadowy presence in England, a distant figure who eventually led her husband to begin tearing England apart. But she is often a personality-less figure in all of this. In reality, Catherine was a tenacious individual, one who expressed her mind forcefully throughout her adult years in England, often to the annoyance of the sitting Spanish ambassador at the Tudor court. A pious Catholic like her parents, she was heavily influenced early on in her time in the country by her confessor, Diego Fernandez, and she was a major supporter of the observant Franciscan movement in her adopted homeland. But despite her forcefulness, she could quite effortlessly perform her role as queen, presiding over court gatherings next to Henry and dispensing patronage where appropriate to the church and others attached to the court. Yet her direct influence on England's politics was minimal, and Catherine did not wish for any greater involvement. Moreover, she retained her Spanish identity throughout her years in England, and while she learned to speak English fluently within her own private apartments and household, there was a largely Spanish staff, and Catherine continued to confess in Spanish even several decades after leaving her homeland. Catherine was also a noted patron of scholars. She was already fluent in Spanish, French, and Latin when she arrived in England, and, although her progress was slow at first, she eventually did become fluent in English. In her adult years, she excelled in her Latin, learning beyond what would be expected of a European royal in the 16th century. She patronized both the University of Oxford and the University of Cambridge as queen, visiting both and interceding directly with Henry over issues and benefactions relating to Queen's College and St. John's College in Cambridge. She also patronized several of the most prominent intellectuals of England in the 1510s and 1520s, notably the antiquarian and poet John Leland, the humanist and physician Thomas Linacre, and the religious reformer and diplomat Richard Pace. She is best remembered, however, for urging the leading Spanish humanist scholar Juan Luis Vives to come to England for a period in the mid-1520s. Here, Vives finished some work on the Church Father Augustine, but his English sojourn is most notable for having composed The Education of a Christian Woman, a highly progressive treatise which argued for the universal education of women. The work was written as a guide of sorts for the Princess Mary and was dedicated to Catherine. It points to the centrality of learning and education to the Queen's worldview. Shortly after Vives completed his educational treatise, the Princess Mary was sent to Ludlow Castle in 1525 to begin maintaining her own household there and to be educated by tutors such as Catherine's former chaplain and the noted Catholic scholar Richard Featherstone. But even as this was occurring, Henry was proactively seeking ways to ensure that a male heir would arrive to supplant Mary as the next in line to the throne. In 1521, Henry had yet again allied with his wife's nation when he and Charles V agreed to go to war again against France. 4 years of conflict followed before Henry effectively decided to go his own way and made an independent peace with King Francis. And in the months that followed, a remarkable shift in affairs occurred, as Henry now began to nail his colours to the mast in favour of the French against the Habsburgs. Though most of the fighting in the War of the League of Cognac, which followed, occurred in Italy as part of the conflict between France and Spain for hegemony there, England played a slight role too. For her part, Catherine despaired in private in the mid-1520s that she was no longer consulted by her husband in these matters, and she rarely heard from her nephew Charles in the way which she had during her father's lifetime when it came to Spanish affairs. If Catherine was increasingly sidelined by her husband in the determination of England's place on the international stage, it simply reflected her position at court. Following the birth of Henry Fitzroy in 1519, the king had entered another affair, this one with Mary Boleyn, the daughter of Sir Thomas Boleyn, who had caught Henry's eye on her wedding day of all days in 1520. Mary was a somewhat scandalous figure who had spent time at the French court in the late 1510s, while her father was serving as England's ambassador to France. She was ordered home to England in 1519 for having engaged in several affairs with French courtiers, including King Francis himself. Now, following her liaisons with Henry, it was rumoured that she had borne the king 2 sons in the early 1520s, but if she did, he did not acknowledge them, perhaps because the exact parentage of the children could not be determined. Yet Mary was ultimately to become a peripheral figure. Rather, it was her sister who would take centre stage in the 1520s. In 1526, Henry began a new affair with Anne Boleyn, Mary's younger sibling, and this time Henry was more committed to his new mistress, and by 1527 he was determined that he would obtain a divorce from Catherine in order to marry again and hopefully produce a legitimate male heir. What was to become known as the king's great matter, his goal of achieving a divorce from his wife of nearly 20 years, would eventually turn every aspect of English political, social and religious life upside down. Henry first alerted his wife in the early summer of 1527 that he was looking into the possibility of a divorce because after 18 years of marriage, his scruples had suddenly been challenged by the chance that their marriage had been unlawful all along. The argument being pursued was that because Catherine had married Henry's brother Arthur, and because that earlier marriage had been consummated, Henry had, effectively, married his own sister in 1509, and this was intolerable in religious law. Therefore, an annulment had to be granted for the marriage. This was hypocritical of Henry in the extreme, to suddenly claim that his scruples around this issue had suddenly been felt 18 years after the event. However, Catherine's family background complicated the matter for Henry. She immediately wrote to her nephew, Charles V, to inform him of the situation. As luck would have it, Charles's forces in Italy had recently captured the city of Rome, and with Pope Clement VII effectively Charles's prisoner there, Henry would not receive an annulment to his marriage anytime soon. With the possibility of an annulment being quickly granted dashed, Cardinal Wolsey now became a central figure in events, and in July 1527 he was dispatched to France, where he envisaged the possibility of setting up a council of cardinals who would run the Roman Catholic Church while Clement was incapacitated in Rome. Such a council would be able to quickly grant Henry his divorce. In tandem, and without Wolsey's knowledge, Henry also dispatched the diplomat William Knight to Rome to seek a dispensation from Clement to at least allow Henry to marry again if the divorce could not be granted straight away. Effectively, this was a request from the King of England, whose scruples were now severely affecting his judgment, that the Pope would sanction him to commit bigamy and have two queens at once. Thinking better of this particularly crazed request, Henry quickly sent a messenger after Knight, who caught up with him somewhere in France and rescinded the order. In any event, both Wolsey and Knight's missions would produce nothing, and in England, Henry was beginning to assemble a collection of church scholars and lawyers who could provide him with legal justifications for the annulment of his marriage. As he did, the great matter would come to dominate court life in England during the late 1520s. As the months went by, the situation altered somewhat. In Rome, Pope Clement was released from captivity by Charles V in December 1527, but the Spanish still controlled the city, and his freedom of action was still heavily curtailed. He eventually consented to send a papal legate in the shape of Cardinal Lorenzo Campeggio to England in the autumn of 1528 to deliberate on the case with Cardinal Wolsey. Secretly, Campeggio had orders to delay the situation as much as possible and to look for an alternative solution to the problem. Having arrived there, he and Wolsey had an audience with Catherine on the 24th of October 1528, following which she requested Campeggio to hear her confession on the 27th. At this, she related to him that although they were married for several months in late 1501 and early 1502, and that she and Arthur had shared a bed on several occasions during that time, the marriage had never been consummated, as they had not had relations. On this issue hinged the entire legal argument which Henry's team of lawyers and churchmen had been devising. If Catherine had never had relations with Arthur, their argument had no substance to it, and no divorce would be forthcoming. Eventually, in late May 1529, the legatine court assembled. Catherine quickly appealed for the hearing to be adjourned and for her case to be heard in Rome. On the 21st of June, both she and Henry spoke before the court, as did Wolsey. For such a significant moment in English political and religious history, there is a frustrating lack of detail in the available sources as to what each of them actually said that day. But we do know that Catherine, at one stage, knelt before Henry and protested that she had been his lawful wife for 20 years, and immediately after this, she left the court despite the calls for her to remain. As a result, Campeggio had to send word to Rome that Catherine was now refusing to cooperate with the proceedings. By the time the message was sent to the Vatican and a response was formulated, the summer recess was nearing in London. On the 23rd of July, Wolsey convinced Campeggio to close proceedings for a time. But it was clear when he did this that there was no intention of resuming activity in the autumn. Having exhausted the possibility of coming to an agreement with Rome and Pope Clement, Henry's ministers, officials and advisors would increasingly look to find an alternative way of obtaining his divorce and bringing an end to his great matter. Throughout this tense period, Catherine and Henry had understandably seen less and less of each other. It should be noted that Henry maintained a clear fondness for her, and even at the height of affairs in late 1528, he is recorded by the contemporary chronicler and historian Edward Hall as having stated, "If I were to marry again, if the marriage might be good, I would surely choose her above all other women." Yet, while she had continued to preside over much of court life as queen, she and Henry rarely dined together by 1529, except on major court occasions where the absence of one would set tongues wagging at court. Henry was also often absent, increasingly in the company of Anne Boleyn and her growing court faction. Somewhat bizarrely, throughout this period, Henry continued to have Catherine sew his shirts for him, something which infuriated Anne. And for her part, Catherine tried to act in as dignified a manner as possible at court, despite her precarious and embarrassing position. She wrote frequently to Charles V and Pope Clement and pressed her nephew's new ambassador, Eustace Chapuis, to implore Rome to categorically refuse to sanction any divorce. However, Clement did not oblige her in this and stated simply that he would not agree to resolve the case unless the parties appeared in Rome. As Clement delayed, Henry grew more desperate, and the Boleyn faction, which included Anne's powerful uncle Thomas Howard, 3rd Duke of Norfolk, increasingly argued that Wolsey was the main impediment to progress. As the most powerful churchman in England and one of the 2 legates appointed by Rome to decide the case, it was in his power to advance the divorce. Henry, who possessed the peculiar combination of being both a coward and a tyrant, did not wish to destroy his most trusted servant and advisor, but felt powerless to resist the growing calls for Wolsey to be supplanted. Eventually, he began revoking the cardinal's powers and stripping him of his properties and wealth. He was, however, permitted to remain as Archbishop of York, and so he set out for the north of England to his diocese in the autumn of 1530, during which journey he died. But while Wolsey was now gone, his removal did not provide a solution in and of itself to the king's great matter. That would only come through the intercession of one of Wolsey's protégés, a rising official called Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell would become one of the critical figures in the months that followed in the new line of argument to obtain the divorce. This held that the English Church was not under the jurisdiction of Rome, and that the English crown held supreme authority over the English Church. As such, Henry could grant himself a divorce. Much of what followed in the course of the early 1530s was intimately connected to the religious turmoil shaking Europe. The Protestant Reformation had begun in Germany, led by reformer Martin Luther in 1517, and in the years that followed, it swept through Central, Western, and Northern Europe as individuals questioned every type of received knowledge about the Church and how it was run. It was in this climate that the scholars and lawyers which Henry had assembled to obtain his divorce began arguing that the kings of England held supremacy over the English Church. This was the line which was followed from 1531 onwards. Cromwell became central to pushing it through, as he coerced England's leading churchmen to accept it. In the process, the establishment of Henry's supremacy would create opportunities for new church figures with Protestant sympathies to gain high office. And, in the act of acquiring his divorce, Henry's actions at this time inadvertently also initiated the English Reformation. But to Henry, in 1531 and 1532, that would have seemed somewhat immaterial, or at least the lesser of 2 evils, the greater one being his inability to get a divorce. Thus, Henry threw his full support behind establishing the supremacy in the early 1530s in order to finally resolve his great matter. Catherine must have known that her time as Queen of England was limited when, in February 1531, a clerical convocation affirmed Henry's position as supreme head of the Church of England. In Rome, Pope Clement responded to this by offering to allow the case concerning his divorce to take place on neutral ground, somewhere outside of England or Rome. But there would be no such case heard now. On the 31st of May 1531, a deputation of 30 of Henry's leading officials and councillors met with Catherine in order to work out a compromise, given that the king was determined to proceed. She tenaciously resisted, defending both the supremacy of Rome over the English Church and the validity of her own marriage, yet again stating that she had never consummated her marriage with Arthur. 6 weeks later, on the 11th of July 1531, she met with Henry for the last time. Thereafter, she was ordered to head north to the Moor Palace in Hertfordshire, effectively being banished from the sight of the royal court. She was also to be cruelly separated from her daughter. Mary was still the royal heir and would reside at Windsor Castle, though she can't have known it at the time that she left London. In the summer of 1531, Catherine would never see her daughter again. The bitter separation was entering its last stages. At the Moor Palace, Catherine was allowed to maintain a considerable household, but she was prohibited from returning to London. In the late autumn, a further deputation of Henry's officials came to visit her. The hope was that Catherine would give up her objection to a trial being held in England to deliberate on the validity of her marriage. If she appeared at such a trial, there was no doubt that it would be stage-managed in such a way as to back up Henry's argument since 1527, that the marriage was invalid, and an annulment would follow in due course. Catherine refused, but by now the matter was out of her hands, and by the late summer of 1532, Anne Boleyn was presiding over the royal court as though she were effectively queen, and in the autumn of that year she accompanied Henry on a royal visit to France. In November, she and Henry were married in secret. A more formal wedding took place in January 1533. By that time, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, a supporter of the supremacy, had been installed as Archbishop of Canterbury, and finally, in May 1533, he convened a special clerical court at Dunstable Priory, which declared Henry and Catherine's marriage to be invalid and annulled. 5 days later, he retroactively sanctioned Henry and Anne's marriage. At last, after 6 years, Henry had obtained his divorce from Catherine. What would Catherine do now? For the second time in her long English odyssey, she found herself cast adrift in a country where her purpose was now unclear. On the first occasion, she had been a young woman, with the vague prospect of a new marriage to Henry being worked out in the aftermath of Arthur's death. But this time there was no such prospect, yet a return to her native Spain was out of the question. She had not been there in over 30 years, and she had few ties to her homeland anymore. Her sister Juana was still there, though still living effectively under house arrest, since her father had accused her of madness decades earlier. Her son, who had effectively usurped her position as ruler of Castile, had left her under house arrest at Tordesillas. The two sisters had not exactly fared well in a world run by men. For Catherine, if Spain held no attraction for her, England offered the only reason for her to reside anywhere. Her daughter Mary was there, and Catherine would have to fight to maintain Mary's position in the new dispensation, which had effectively sidelined her with the annulment of Catherine's marriage to Henry. As such, the conclusion of Henry's great matter early in 1533 did not bring Catherine's own personal struggle with her husband to an end. At first, Henry attempted to placate Catherine with an offer of the title of Princess Dowager. Catherine refused, and she was consulting with the imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuis around this time to try to have him press the papacy to issue a definitive condemnation of Henry's renunciation of his marriage to her. Simultaneously, it is clear that there was widespread public support throughout England for Catherine and her cause. This was exhibited most publicly in the prophecies of Elizabeth Barton. Barton, who is variously remembered as the Holy Maid of Kent and the Mad Maid of Kent, had gained a reputation throughout England in the 1520s as a prophetess who had visions. She had even met with Cardinal Wolsey and Henry in 1528. But despite their earlier acquaintance, Barton was preaching in 1532 that if Henry remarried, he would die soon afterwards. She even claimed that she had seen the place in hell where he would be sent. Her public appearances gained large crowds, which expressed support for Catherine and vilified Anne. Thus, although Barton herself was eventually arrested, tried and hanged at Tyburn on charges of treason, the episode points towards how much support Catherine enjoyed from the common people of the country, over which she had been queen for more than 23 years. Conversely, Anne had been received in a tepid fashion by the London crowds during her coronation. As 1533 turned into 1534, Catherine's position became more and more awkward for Henry. In March of that year, the papacy finally issued its pronouncements on the divorce. Unsurprisingly, they were entirely supportive of Catherine's position. Then, in May, Catherine refused to swear an oath which the government was asking people to subscribe to, which would recognize any children which Anne Boleyn would have by the king. This would place Anne's children ahead of Mary in the royal succession, and Catherine was unwilling to accept it. She wrote to Mary advising her to refuse the oath as well. At the same time, she was forced to move to Kimbolton House in Huntingdonshire, and her household was much reduced to match her more limited financial means. Those who remained primarily consisted of about 24 Spaniards, the core group being her confessor, her maids, several stewards, and some grooms. Here she insisted on continuing to be addressed as the Queen. Whatever her aspirations were, though, her life was increasingly restricted. She had to get permission to receive visitors, and even when Mary was ill in late 1534 and early 1535, Henry refused Catherine permission to be allowed to visit her. The concern was that if Catherine and her daughter managed to escape together to the continent, they could later press Mary's claim to the throne, with the backing of Charles V and the papacy. In the intricate European politics of the 16th century, this was not an entirely unfounded fear. Catherine remained defiant to the last. Throughout 1535, she continued to pursue various channels to request that the new Pope, Paul III, should issue a declaration stating that Henry was excommunicated from the Church as a result of his disobeying the papacy's directives with regard to their marriage. However, these efforts were sabotaged by her own nephew. Charles V was preparing to go to war again with France, and the last thing he needed was an announcement from the papacy which would push England into supporting the French in the new conflict which eventually broke out in 1536. Thus, Catherine would never live to see her husband condemned fully by Rome. Her health had been deteriorating in the autumn of 1535, and by December, when Ambassador Chapuis visited her, she was very ill. She worsened further in the first days of January and died at Kimbolton at 2 p.m. on the 7th of January. An autopsy of sorts afterwards revealed that her heart was damaged and black throughout. It is likely that this was a secondary condition caused by a melanotic carcinoma. Rumors that she had been poisoned are very unlikely to have been accurate. She was buried at Peterborough Abbey, although no monument was erected to mark the site as being the grave of the woman who had been Queen of England for nearly a quarter of a century. The England that Catherine departed from in 1536 was just beginning to enter a vast period of change which was closely tied to Henry's quest to divorce her. The drive to establish Henry as supreme head of the English Church had seen religious figures such as the new Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, obtain control over much of the Church throughout England. In the years that followed, these individuals began reforming church practice and introduced a version of the new Protestant religion. Just as Catherine left the world, the hundreds of monasteries and nunneries which had dotted England for centuries were being shut down, while in churches all over the country, altars were being stripped back to more austere interiors in line with Protestant practice. Though there would be Catholic reactions and periods of more radical Protestantism in the 20 years that followed, nothing in the end could turn back the tide of religious and social change which was initiated through efforts to find a resolution to Henry VIII's great matter. Perhaps Henry would not have minded. In October 1537, he got his wish when a legitimate male heir called Edward was born to his third wife, Jane Seymour. Yet that son, for which Henry had strived for so long, would only rule for 6 years after Henry himself died in 1547. Thus, Catherine's daughter Mary became Queen of England after all in 1553. Catherine of Aragon is one of the most curious figures in English political history. In a great many accounts of the tumultuous events of the late 1520s and early 1530s, she is regularly mentioned, but comes across as a personality-less key character. She is usually presented as the roadblock which prevented Henry VIII from marrying Anne Boleyn. But Henry and Anne are the personalities in these accounts, and Catherine is an important but shadowy figure in the background, of which nothing is ever usually said, except that she had to be removed. This does her a disservice. Catherine was a proud, tenacious woman who overcame a considerable degree of adversity after being cast adrift in a foreign land as a teenager, during a time when women of her background were often mere bartering tools in international diplomacy. As queen, she acted as a progressive patron of scholars and supported the education of women in England. And then, when her troubled natal history eventually led Henry to try to dispense with her, she doggedly fought to maintain her own position and, more importantly, her daughter's position as heir to the throne of England. All of this stands considerably in her favour. Curiously enough, perhaps the greatest testament to Catherine's character was provided by Henry VIII himself. Of Henry's other 5 wives, there were 2 he did not dispense of. His third wife, Jane Seymour, died owing to postnatal complications after giving birth to the future King Edward VI, while his 6th and final wife, Catherine Parr, outlived Henry by a year. However, the other 3 were not treated kindly. His marriage to his 4th wife, Anne of Cleves, was quickly annulled in 1540 after Henry stated, "She is nothing so fair as hath been reported." His 5th wife, Catherine Howard, was beheaded after she was found guilty of having committed adultery, while Anne Boleyn, the woman for whom Henry spent so many years trying to divorce Catherine in order to marry her, was found guilty of treason on quite possibly spurious charges in 1536 and beheaded as well, just 3 years after marrying Henry. By way of contrast, Henry, who probably respected Catherine more than any of his other wives, allowed his former Spanish consort to live on in England after he had finally obtained his divorce. Though her liberties were restricted at a time when there was a very real fear that Charles V would declare war on England over the divorce, at least Catherine kept her head, which is more than many others who got in Henry's way could say. What do you think of Catherine of Aragon? Do you think she was right to resist Henry's attempts to divorce her so strongly and for so long? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.